Well, hi everyone. So today we're joined with Fiona Winning, and we'll be talking about her experiences as part of the Prison Residencies project. So we're going to go straight into it. So hi Fiona.
Hi Amanda, nice to see you.
And you, yeah. So we're going to get straight to it with the questions. So if you could just tell us a little bit about your arts practice.
Yeah, as I describe it in my very brief artist statement, I think it's my practice is about prompting and nudging people to think about things that I present to them. Um, so sometimes that could be very provocative, other times it could be just to reflect on a word or an idea. Some of it happens through made work that I create. Other times it happens in groups that I work with. So and that could be um, a group of artists that come together, or it could be a group of people who want to come and learn a little bit about how to be more creative. So yeah, that's what my work's about, really.
So how did that prompting come to be? Because that's quite a challenging thing to do, isn't it? To try and get prompts out of people. Sometimes I'm sure it must be quite challenging to do that.
Well, I prompt them, so and sometimes I never know where that prompt has gone.
Yeah.
But in a way, it feels important just to put it out there in the world. And I think probably over the last 5 years, my work's been more about that.
Mhm.
And during that time, I've created objects that I've placed in public spaces. I've created objects that I've placed in sort of gallery places,
Yeah.
and um, and usually those made objects have been to do with something I've noticed or something that has made me pull up and think, God, what's that? And I suppose a particular thing that comes to mind is homelessness. I moved to Bristol about probably nearly 6 years ago,
Okay.
and that sort of confrontation created this prompt. And I made a thing called Gold Tent, and I was inviting people to think about all the things connected with homelessness,
Yeah.
and also how one views one's private space. And maybe there's a link to that really with what the residency how the residency idea came about, possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as you picking up on what you just said about your residency project, so looking at your previous work, and how did that influence your project that you had for the prison residencies program?
Well, directly through working in a prison setting, directly. Um, and going back a few years, working in C category prisons,
Yeah.
where the prisoners are able to access work opportunities and education opportunities.
Yeah.
I was in the position to facilitate some of that learning, but also to be being in the prison estate, very conscious of how people are treated, both the inmates themselves, the prisoners themselves, and also the people working with them.
Mhm.
And this really came to my mind when I went to visit the prison with Luminara before the residency started.
Yes.
Um, I have actually worked at Shepton Prison when it was a working prison. Um, so the environment and the architecture was familiar, even though it's a little bit different when there are no bodies around, because that
Yes.
creates a sense of scale. So the scale was very different. But entering the C wing, and then as I entered the first cell, the thing that crossed my mind was thresholds, and how sometimes I'm completely not aware of different thresholds that I pass.
Mm.
And it struck me that passing from outside of the cell into the cell reminded me of the person who was in that cell, and the fact that this was their personal space.
Yeah.
And following that train of thought, I think I may have had a conversation with Luminara about it. And then this idea of respect came to my mind.
Mhm.
And I thought, okay, let's follow that and see where that goes. And that is how I set up the theme. That's how the theme arrived for my residency. And again, it it sort of fits my way of thinking in terms of prompting and nudging people. And that's what I did. I wrote words, actually, didn't expect to do that, but I wrote words in tape.
Yep.
So tape graffiti, so very easy to take down.
Yes.
um, and some of the tape words were capital letters and were
Yeah.
very loud. And later on in the residency, they got a little bit more conversational. So the text was less capital letter, but it was more sort of lowercase.
Yeah.
Just interesting. Those two things came into my mind, partly prompted by another artist who was aware that, well, very aware of my letters being quite loud, and I didn't.
Right.
I guess that that made me think about it, which was
Yeah.
interesting. So lots of sort of words around, and I created a space where I was inviting people to come and think.
Hmm.
And that thinking could have been quiet, internal thinking, or it could have been a vocal thinking, so they could be thinking out loud.
Yeah.
And that links to my sort of more recent way of working, which is as a coach.
Yeah.
Why I am inviting people to think out loud. And I just thought it would be a curious thing to create and present in this environment. And I made a little space that was comfortable as it could be, without bringing in all sorts of interior design kind of stuff. I wanted to
Yeah.
make it was still seen as a sort of a rather bleak and austere and rather in keeping with the brutal architecture around about. But I was lucky I had a carpet, so that instantly enabled people to come in and feel a little bit different about it. Although I did challenge people with another prompt,
Yeah.
which was about this threshold, and I invited people. It was an invitation. Maybe it sounded a bit like a direction, but to
Yeah.
take the shoes off before they came
Yeah.
into the space. And as the days went by, I noticed that for some people that was a barrier,
Okay.
and for other people they were willing to go with it. And that again was an interesting consequence of that prompt that I hadn't necessarily followed in my own way of thinking. Because it was meant as an action, a demonstration of respect, to take your shoes
Yeah.
off before you enter a different space.
Mm.
And I did provide some little pull-on shoe covers that I made for
Lovely.
shoes. But as a result of that prompt, had some very interesting conversations with people about why not.
Yeah.
So I had ideas around, yes, it's a respectful thing to do. It's not a common thing to do in this country, not our culture.
No.
So the sort of cultural differences came in about whether you do as a habit or not. And also, interesting, I had a visitor who was Spanish, and he had lots to say about carpets and
Oh,
how
yes.
where he lives in Spain, they don't have carpets. And so this idea of slipping your sandals off and being barefoot is quite a natural thing to do.
Yeah.
With no connection with a religious thing, but it was just a natural thing to do. And he didn't take his shoes off to come and join us in the thinking room because he was worried about his smelly feet. So there was another issue that creates this sort of thing of self-consciousness and self-awareness of how doing something might affect somebody else. So that was another interesting
Yes.
part of the conversation, really.
Yeah, and I suppose things that could be seen or taken for granted, so it's quite a simple action, but actually it's quite a complex issue. And did you find that during your course of residency, and looking at the subject matter of theme of respect, so it's quite a very complicated issue, how did you find the general public's reaction?
They were why the long pause? I'm reminded of one particular person who came in and he went off on a slightly different tack, but even so, on the whole, people were interested in it, and agreed with it, and it led to conversations around self-respect, and that was an important area that I was hoping that people would bring up in conversation. And I also had a chat with someone who alerted me and reminded me, certainly in the sort of criminal justice setting and in the whole area of crime,
Yeah.
that it may be a completely different way of thinking if when you consider somebody who has been affected quite drastically by a crime having been committed,
Mm.
and they being the victim of a crime.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting sort of area to discuss with him. And we did come round to the point that, and we sort of we looked at and considered the area of where people are not brought up with the idea of respect as being embedded or part of their value system.
Yeah.
Um, and that reminded me very much of people that or some of the people I came in contact with in a prison setting.
Mm.
So again, the conversation opened up into parenting and all those areas where we learn the skills, the life skills that we take with us through our lives.
Mm.
Um, he actually had met somebody who'd been in Shepton Mallet, and that was another area of our conversation that was interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are. I mean, I'm aware that I mean, another issue around this whole idea is that people coming to a prison, they come for different reasons.
Yeah.
And while the residency was taking place, we had prison tours and other various fun and games going on upstairs.
Yes. Yeah.
Being locked in a cell, um, and and then also the visitors who came particularly specifically to see the residency. And it was interesting for people who came across us by accident,
Yeah.
who hadn't known about what was going on, and they popped their heads round, and that engaged a different kind of thinking, a different kind of conversation, really. More of a what are you doing? What's it for? Rather than oh, okay, yes, yeah.
Yeah. And if it's okay to ask, what for someone like yourself who has previously worked in the prison setting,
Mm.
what was it like re-entering that space? Because obviously you have a history with prisons. So
Mm.
if that's okay to ask,
Yeah.
how did you find that experience?
Oh, a range of feelings, really. Sadness, coldness,
Mhm.
familiarity, memories of humorous times,
Yeah.
memories of rather desperate times, memories of frustration. I think that probably was the overwhelming thing. Memories of being in a setting where you lose your control. It's taken away from you. Your sense
Mhm.
of empowerment is taken away from you, and that triggered some ideas and some thoughts around my feelings around criminal justice and how. And I suppose that was probably the link that led or was more connected to some of the research that some of the other artists were doing in terms of women in prison. And
Yeah.
at the time of our residency, there were all sorts of issues being discussed in the public realm and on social media and on the news. And there were moments where it reminded me of well, no, I mean, I was angry. There were moments where I
Yeah.
was feeling very angry about things. And that may well have had a connection, subconsciously or otherwise, with some of the way in which I intervened with the area outside of my cell. I sort of moved out of my cell with some of my work, some of the work
Yeah.
I was doing. And I wrote pause in big letters on the floor. And I wrote some other words on the floor that, having had a conversation with one of the other artists, I withdrew. I felt it a bit, it maybe I was intruding with my loudness.
Right.
But it was, yeah, I suppose having worked in a prison setting, having managed all that sort of emotional neediness,
Mm.
and at the end feeling very drained and sort of almost dried up. And I mean, burnout is the term that people use
Yeah.
when you've spent a long time with people who are rather desperate. Um,
Yes.
so all those things are sort of mulling around
Yes.
as
And
a result of having been there.
do
Yeah.
you think that obviously there's an awful lot of mixed emotions that have come from this project for you. Is that something you feel that obviously you were kind of coming out of your cell a little bit and you was moving around into the wider space? By doing that, do you think you was able to tackle some of those emotions, or do you think this is could be an ongoing project for you? No, it's a challenging question.
But it is, and I've been thinking about it because I started some ideas for work while I was working in the prison setting, and one of the ideas I started was looking at space and how people can manage and confine spaces. And I suppose that whole thing has been turned upside down because we've been in lockdown and
Yeah.
we've all been experiencing that sense of isolation and having to manage in smaller spaces than perhaps we would usually do. I made a measured drawing of the inside of a cell, and from memory, it was something like 6.5 feet by 9 feet,
Right.
which is and still is in some prisons the size of a single cell.
Yeah.
And I've still got that piece of tracing paper. I wrapped it up and folded it in a container which has the name of the prison on the front of it.
Right.
So that's an idea that's not really been taken any further than simply doing that.
Mm.
And there was another idea that I was talking to one of the other artists about, which was a waiting wall. And we played around with the idea of weight as in heaviness
Yeah.
and weight as in time.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't say that we'd follow that through into a collaboration, but certainly the collaborative thinking was interesting. And I think one of your questions was about collaboration. And I think that was probably, so rather than having anything that was made or created as a collaboration, I think I participated in collaborative thinking and sort of
Right.
prompting suggestions that the other artists might want to engage in. And one of those things resulted in a lovely voice piece that we did together, based on a poem that one of the artists wrote.
Mm.
So that is something that interests me, because in the prison setting you would get a more limited audience, I think. Yeah, either people coming out of curiosity or wanting to be entertained or wanting to be scared because of the ghosts and all that,
Yes.
or people who are curious about artists doing residencies in unusual places. So I suppose there are ideas that could come out of that, and maybe one of those is about voice and using the power of the voice to express feelings and things like that. Maybe, yeah, lots of ideas that could develop. And I've got a stack of them over there.
Yes.
Just know which one to take further.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think something that really came through on your work was that, obviously, as you mentioned earlier, your words were quite big and loud, and or could be perceived that way. But what I think was incredibly interesting is that even though they are words that are being read, you wanted to be heard. And I
Mm.
think for the prison setting, that notion of being heard
Mm.
is very difficult at times, even within a residency setting, or from your previous experience, working within the criminal justice system. And I'd just be interested to know, as well, just for myself, and I'm sure everyone else watching this, is, do you think that the thought process of being heard is something that could be taken over to a collaborative project or developed more in a different way? It may be not even in a prison setting, maybe taken out into a different space. I'd just like your thoughts on that, really.
Yeah. Everybody wants to be heard.
Yes.
And sometimes that's done through stories, other times it's done through particular um, ideas. Yes, I do want to be heard.
Yeah. Yeah, we most
And,
definitely all do, don't we?
yeah. I'm sort of visualizing myself on the top of a cliff and just sort of shouting very
Yeah.
loud. It would something I didn't do that I was going to do was to go to the top of the wing and just play around with. Well, I did unofficially did a bit of
Right.
shouting, shouting around, but there is something very powerful about the voice,
Mm.
and it is one way of being heard. There's also something very powerful about the written word, and I wouldn't say that I'm a writer, but I do love words.
Yeah.
Um, um,
And words
and I
can be
think, sorry,
interpreted, can't they?
sorry.
Words can be interpreted in different ways as well. Same as
Definitely.
hearing a voice, obviously tonal things come into play. And C wing was actually quite a large wing in sense of scale, wasn't it? It did
Mm.
have different levels. Were you able to go on to different levels at all and sort of play around with the physical space?
I didn't do very much of that um, because I was
Yes.
waiting in my room, and I called it in the end. I think on the day before the last day, I've called it the waiting room because I'd been waiting for people to come and
Mm.
engage with my prompts, and I didn't take that waiting outside very much actually. No, I went up onto the second level when we were doing the voice piece.
Yeah.
So I sort of I read my words from that level, but I didn't go to the top level. Did I even exploring the top level? I don't think I did. So you're sort of reminding me a little bit of a sort of self-imposed um, restriction,
Mm.
which is interesting. Because I would see myself as somebody who was quite brave, but maybe there were aspects of me around that prism that I didn't explore, and it wasn't just because of time, maybe because I didn't want to,
Mm.
or I was nervous about it, or so that's interesting. I'm sort of as we're talking, I'm sort of wrapping my arms around myself as
I'll
if
send you a virtual hug.
yeah, that sense of closing down. Well, yeah, sort of rather than big, sort of closing down, and that may be something to do with because at the end of the residency, I was sort of writing, cutting out small letters
Mm.
and putting them on the wall of the thinking room, the
Yeah.
space for thinking, the waiting room, and I got quite absorbed in sort of writing my own handwriting and then cutting out the letters and then putting them on the wall.
Yeah.
And that felt like a very different activity, but I was contained in that space,
Mm.
um, which was beginning to take on a different sense.
Definitely, that sounds a lot more personal from your first ideas that that we've spoken to begin with, that you had for the outset for this project. Obviously, just going back to what you said before, obviously your words were quite large, they were capitals, then they gradually moved to lowercase, and then they become even smaller to the your handwriting scale. so
Yeah.
so your probably your train of thoughts, or just your maybe emotional feelings as well attached to the project, gradually became singular rather than working within a group, possibly because obviously all of your activities were group based, weren't they, from the start for your residency? There was a lot of inviting people to come
Yeah.
in a group or on their own, but obviously, as you said, you was waiting, and then towards the end it became quite individualized. I think is the word I'll choose for this one. How do you feel about that?
I think one part of it was, but then the other part was still um, bigger. I had my first listening circle
Yes.
on the Sunday. I'd anticipated having more of those, but in fact, the listening was less of a circle, but it was more sort of 1-to-1 or 1-to-2. So when small
Mm-hmm.
groups were coming in, but this was the particular idea I'd had that was that had a format, and
Yeah.
that happened on the Sunday, and so that was a group thing, and that came from outside coming in. I mean, this inside outside is quite interesting. Um, so although I was sort of focusing on these sort of little bits of text, there was an interesting dynamic that was going on, and And this has probably got something to do with my experience of residencies. Certainly, I think that most residencies I've done more recently, I mean, way back it was different, but more recently, I suppose I've been on my either on my own or one other. So this
Yeah.
was a much bigger group, even though not everybody was there. The artists weren't there, but I suppose I was conscious of not wanting to. I'm not sure what that was all about. So it wasn't really about being sort of solo, individual, or introspective. It was more about just. It's funny. The thing that comes to mind is when you breathe, when you sort of, then you have a little breath, quiet breath. Maybe I was just having a breather. Actually,
Yeah.
that's what it was. It was a breather inside the space for thinking out some ideas, and then the residency ended. Had it not ended, then maybe the breath might have got a bit bigger again. I don't know.
Mm.
And I'm struck by this idea of breathing. This all sounds very abstract, and but then that's the way I think.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that's the way to be. I mean, that would just lead me into kind of my final question, really, and it would just be, um, where do you think this project could go, or is there anything in particular that have come out of this residency that you'd like to take forward? I think we've covered some of that, but is there any particular things that have really stood out for you at all?
Well, certainly there are going to be some listening circles. That will happen, um, and but they might not be specifically about criminal justice, but I'm curious about having conversations about that. Um, there were some connections made with one or two other artists around ideas that link with ideas that are sort of I'm thinking about other than the residency, sort of before
Yeah.
the residency. And one of those is thresholds,
Hmm.
and just considering what they are, and certainly I suppose uh, uh, where I am in my life,
Yeah.
thresholds are quite on my mind. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean there are, but I'm not sure what they are yet.
Yeah. So there's
It,
lots to develop from what it
there's
sounds
lots to
like.
develop. Yeah, lots to develop. Yeah, lots to develop.
And just to wrap this up then, with your upcoming listening circles, are they going to be in person, or can people of the public join in? How will that work for you? Do you know yet?
Well, I want to come out. I want to come away from Zoom. I want to come out.
Yes.
So I'm going to arrange some in-person ones and also some Zoom ones. The
Yeah.
Zoom ones are are great because people from all over the world can join in.
Yeah.
Where personal ones will be more local. But I'm just amazed, constantly amazed how or of the value of listening. And I just think it's so undervalued and so underrated. Just having an opportunity to be listened to
Hmm.
without anybody offering you suggestions or advice or do this, do that, just to be heard.
Yeah.
And I suppose that links to what I was talking about earlier. I would just love for people to experience that because I have done many times, and it's it's beautiful. It's a beautiful experience. So that will certainly be something I should be doing. And I think um, I quite like to I quite like to develop the respect idea too. That'll be something separate from listening circle, but I think it's got lots in it. And working with other artists, I think that's something I want to do more of. Is to work with other artists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Oh, well, I hope all of those things happen in the not too distant future, and we'll keep everyone updated as best we can with Fiona's progress. And thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really great insight into your overview of your work that you've done with us. So yeah, it's really appreciated for your time. Thank you.
And thank you, Mad. I appreciate this opportunity to
That's okay.
share my thoughts with you.
No, you're
And
more
thank
than
you
welcome.
for being, yeah, thank you for being so busy and involved in the project. It's been great.
No, that's great.
Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Fiona, and we'll speak to you soon.
Great.